I'll begin by addressing something that certain viewers might choose to skip over, yet it remains essential to mention. Once you reach 60 years of age, the pursuit of romantic connection can emerge as one of the most dangerous emotional traps awaiting you during this chapter of your existence. I'm sharing this perspective not to discourage you, but because observing countless situations has uncovered a devastating pattern. Individuals who finally achieved inner tranquility following years of emotional turbulence consistently undermine this precious achievement they've worked so hard to obtain, driven by an apprehension about confronting what ought to be treated as sacred, the encounter with their authentic self. The quietude that arrives beyond this milestone in life isn't an emptiness requiring completion. Rather, it represents hard-won territory that gets sacrificed on the altar of misinterpreted solitude. What you're about to discover might protect your remaining years from unnecessary emotional devastation. Carl Gustav Jung served as a Swiss psychiatrist who dedicated decades to exploring the uncharted territories of human consciousness. Through his extensive clinical experience and profound studies of mythology, spiritual traditions, and diverse cultures across the globe, he mapped the most hidden corners of the human psyche. His revelations concerning the collective unconscious, the individuation journey, and the second portion of existence continue to be groundbreaking. Few people realize that his observations regarding mature relationships carry an urgent warning that most individuals completely disregard, with devastating consequences for their inner peace. Before unveiling these profound psychological truths, it's remarkable how these patterns of consciousness transcend every cultural barrier. If you wish to preserve inner peace while navigating the complexities of mature relationships, show your support for this content and follow along so we can continue exploring humanity's deepest mysteries. Depth psychology has revealed what contemporary society refuses to acknowledge. The latter portion of existence demands a radical transformation in psychological orientation. During your 20s, mental energy naturally flows outward toward establishing careers, forming families, and securing your position in society. Around 40, a fragile balance gets established, but somewhere between 60 and 70, something fundamental must occur. The natural trajectory of the psyche turns inward, not outward. Years of clinical observation have identified a disturbing pattern. Therapy offices receive individuals between 60 and 70 who appear successful on the surface, but feel hollow inside. Devastated by desperate searches that literally destroy the world they spent their entire lives building. They confuse solitude with emptiness. They mistake physical companionship for emotional completeness, and in this confusion, they sacrifice their most valuable achievement. Therapeutic work has repeatedly demonstrated that during this phase exists what's known as the essential challenge, the individuation process. This fundamental concept refers to the moment when we finally shed our social masks, what was termed the persona, and turn toward our authentic identity. This occurs when we begin incorporating our shadow, that portion of ourselves we've denied for decades, and seek what has been defined as psychological wholeness. But here exists a devastating problem. Many fall into the illusion that having someone nearby will provide salvation from existential aloneness, and this represents potentially the worst psychological trap at this life stage. Solitude doesn't get resolved through physical companionship. It dissolves when we learn to inhabit our own being without fear, without escape, without requiring external validation. Clinical cases have documented a troubling reality. Individuals who spent years winning emotional independence, who finally broke free from suffocating relationships, who discovered the simple pleasures of autonomy, reading without interruptions, deciding when and at what time without negotiating with anyone, enjoying silence, systematically demolish these achievements. For what reason? Because of societal pressure, because of mortality fears, because of the mistaken conviction that dying alone represents the most terrible tragedy. Psychological research has identified a significant point. Beyond 60, those who seek relationships out of need, fear, or unfilled emptiness repeat neurotic patterns that should have been overcome. They aren't seeking affection, they're fleeing from themselves. They aren't looking for companionship, they're avoiding the inevitable encounter with their own essence. And what price accompanies this flight? Loss of the hard-won inner peace, loss of freedom, loss of vital energy in your final years, loss of irreplaceable time. Everything gets sacrificed on the altar of illusion, believing that another person can fill a void that only you can complete from within. This concerns existence itself. The longer you postpone this meeting with yourself, the more brutal it will become when it finally happens. If you avoid it by entering relationships founded on fear and neediness, you condemn your remaining years to psychological mediocrity. But this deep analysis wasn't merely a grim diagnosis. It offered a pathway, a map for navigating mature relationships without sacrificing your essence. Write the word path in the comments if you're ready to learn this map. Years of clinical work produced a revolutionary understanding. A vast difference exists between seeking relationships through conscious choice and seeking them from desperate necessity. Analytical psychology demonstrated that healthy relationships after 60 remain possible, but only when they emerge from a place of inner completeness, not vacancy. When you've already made peace with your solitude, when you've already integrated your shadow, when you've already done the crucial work of becoming who you genuinely are, here's what was discovered about authentic, mature relationships. They don't fill voids, they celebrate fullness. They don't rescue people, they unite already whole individuals. They don't steal freedom, they multiply opportunities for mutual development. This approach revealed distinct markers that differentiate healthy relationships from psychological traps. And if you understand these markers, you can safeguard your peace while remaining open to genuine connection. What follows might completely transform your perspective on relationships during life's second half. Point 1. Fear of solitude, the first psychological trap. The initial pattern identified in therapists' offices worldwide stuns with its simplicity. People enter destructive relationships exclusively to avoid confronting aloneness. But here's the fundamental psychological truth that few comprehend. Solitude and feelings of emptiness aren't synonymous. Clinical observations have repeatedly shown that you can be alone yet feel complete, be at peace with yourself, enjoying what you've achieved. But when you confuse aloneness with abandonment, when you believe you require another person to feel complete, you begin mortgaging your emotional freedom. One documented case perfectly illustrates this. Maria, 67 years old, widowed for 5 years. Following decades of marriage that oscillated between moments of joy and periods of deep frustration, she finally found peace. She rediscovered simple pleasures, reading without interruptions, deciding her daily schedule without negotiations, enjoying silence. But social and family pressure made her believe she needed a life companion. "You'll die alone," they told her. Within 6 months with Roberto, an authoritarian man who restructured her life, her schedule, even the furniture arrangement in her home, Maria completely lost the peace she had won. Out of fear of returning to solitude, she permitted this. Her tranquility evaporated. The therapeutic analysis revealed something devastating. Maria hadn't sought a partner. She had sought an anesthetic against the fear of death. Roberto hadn't arrived to share her existence. He arrived to occupy it. Point 2. Unconscious repetition of patterns. The second trap. Depth psychology identified that many individuals between 60 and 70 unconsciously reproduce the exact same relationship dynamics they experienced in their youth. If you were a caretaker who sacrificed yourself, you'll likely attract someone who needs rescuing. If you were dependent, you'll seek someone who dominates. If you were controlling, you'll find someone who accepts being controlled. The trap doesn't lie in the pattern itself, but in the unconscious repetition without awareness. Richard, 72 years old, spent 45 years in a marriage where he played the provider and protector role. His wife depended entirely on him for decisions, finances, even social interactions. After her passing, instead of exploring his own independence, he quickly found Martha, a woman in an extremely vulnerable situation who needed someone to resolve her problems. Richard felt useful again. But therapeutic analysis revealed the truth. He hadn't found love. He had found a familiar role, a comfort zone, a way to avoid confronting his own emotional vulnerability. Point 3. The sacrifice of one freedom. The third trap. Perhaps the most heartbreaking pattern is witnessing people who spent years achieving emotional autonomy systematically destroy it for relationships that add nothing meaningful. John, 68, divorced after 30 years of a suffocating marriage, spent 5 years discovering himself. He learned to cook, joined hiking groups, started painting, built deep friendships. For the first time in his existence, he felt genuinely free. Then he met Susan, who began slowly but surely demanding more of his time, more of his attention, more of his emotional energy. The painting got abandoned, the hiking ceased, the friendships weakened. Within a year, John was back exactly where he started, living for someone else's approval, sacrificing his desires, feeling trapped. The therapeutic work revealed that John had entered this relationship not from attraction or compatibility, but from the persistent social message that being alone equals failure. Point 4. The confusion between company and connection. The fourth trap. Contemporary culture has created a dangerous confusion. We're taught that physical presence equals emotional connection, that having someone nearby is what matters. But depth psychology exposed the truth. You can feel profoundly lonely despite being in a relationship, and completely connected while physically alone. Carmen, 65 years old, after 3 years of solitude following divorce, met Daniel. They began living together quickly. Daniel was physically present, but emotionally absent. He sat on the couch while she cooked. He was there during meals but lost in his phone. He shared her bed, but not her thoughts, dreams, or fears. Carmen felt lonelier than when she actually lived alone. But she persisted in the relationship for 2 years, because at least she wasn't alone, technically speaking. The therapeutic analysis revealed the devastating truth. Carmen had traded authentic solitude, which allowed space for reflection and growth, for false companionship that generated only emotional emptiness. Point 5. Death panic as motivation. The fifth and most dangerous trap. Perhaps the most powerful and least discussed factor is mortality fear. After 60, the awareness that time is finite becomes inescapable, and many interpret this awareness as an urgent call to find someone, anyone, to not die alone. But here lies the psychological trap. This urgency generated by death panic is the worst possible foundation for healthy relationships. Margaret, 70 years old, after her husband's death, became obsessed with the idea of dying alone. This fear became so overwhelming that she accepted the first man who showed interest. Frank was emotionally distant, often disrespectful, and clearly more interested in her financial stability than genuine companionship. But Margaret tolerated everything, because her ultimate fear wasn't an unhappy relationship. It was dying without anyone by her bedside. Therapeutic work revealed something profound. Margaret needed to confront not the fear of dying alone, but the deeper fear, had she lived authentically. When that question remained unanswered, death panic became unbearable. But when we resolve it, the urgency to find someone dissolves naturally. At this point, you might wonder, does this mean relationships after 60 are impossible or inadvisable? Absolutely not. But they require something radically different from relationships in youth. They require what psychology terms integration work. Before seeking someone, you must complete the task of becoming whole yourself. This isn't selfishness, it's psychological necessity. How do you know if you're seeking a relationship from wholeness or emptiness? Here are the clear indicators. If the idea of spending Saturday night alone generates anxiety, you're acting from emptiness. If you can spend Saturday night alone peacefully and still choose to go out, you're acting from wholeness. If you need constant messages, calls, validation that you're important to someone, you're acting from neediness. If you appreciate messages but don't depend on them for your emotional well-being, you're acting from autonomy. If you tolerate disrespectful behavior because being alone seems worse, you're trapped. If you can walk away from anyone who doesn't honor your worth, you're free. If you enter a relationship hoping it will give your life meaning, you're building on sand. If you enter a relationship wanting to share the meaning you've already found, you're building on rock. The difference is subtle, but absolutely crucial. One approach leads to emotional dependence, loss of identity, and eventual resentment. The other leads to mutual growth, respect, and authentic connection. But here's what few discuss. Achieving this wholeness requires real work. It's not automatic. It doesn't arrive simply because you reached a certain age. It demands conscious confrontation with everything you've avoided throughout your existence. And that brings us to what psychology identified as the essential process for the second half of life: shadow work. Every human possesses aspects of themselves they've rejected, denied, buried deep in their unconscious. The selfish parts, the angry parts, the wounded parts, the needy parts. We spend the first portion of life constructing an acceptable image, a persona that the world will approve of. But in the second portion, we must deconstruct that mask and integrate everything we rejected. Why? Because those rejected parts don't disappear. They leak out in destructive ways. The anger you never acknowledged emerges as passive aggression. The neediness you never accepted transforms into emotional manipulation. The vulnerability you always hid creates emotional distance. Until you confront and integrate these aspects, you'll repeat the same patterns in every relationship. Sarah, 69 years old, had always prided herself on being strong and independent. But therapeutic work revealed that beneath that strength hid profound vulnerability she had never acknowledged. She attracted partners who exploited that hidden vulnerability, precisely because she refused to own it consciously. Once Sarah did the work of acknowledging and integrating her vulnerability, her relationship patterns transformed completely. She stopped attracting exploiters and began connecting with people who could honor both her strength and vulnerability. This is the work that must occur before entering healthy, mature relationships. Not because you need to be perfect, but because you need to be conscious of your patterns, aware of your triggers, honest about your limitations. Here's the practical guidance for this shadow work. Start with radical honesty about your relationship history. Not the story you tell others, but the truth you perhaps never admitted to yourself. In past relationships, what patterns repeated? Were you always the one sacrificing? Always the one being rescued? Always the one in control? Always the one submitting? Write it down. Don't judge it. Just observe it. Then ask yourself, what was I trying to avoid by playing that role? The person who constantly sacrifices often avoids acknowledging their own needs. The person who rescues others often avoids confronting their own helplessness. The person who controls often avoids vulnerability. The person who submits often avoids responsibility. These aren't moral judgments, they're psychological mechanisms we all employ. But to transform them, we must first see them clearly. Next, practice conscious solitude. Not the kind where you're alone but distracted by television, social media, constant activity. Real solitude. You, sitting in silence. You, observing your thoughts, feelings, reactions. Initially, this will feel uncomfortable. Our minds are programmed to flee from silence. Continue anyway. Gradually, you'll understand that solitude isn't emptiness. It's fertile ground where your authentic self can flourish. Journal what you discover during these moments. What fears surface? What memories return? What desires emerge? This begins what's called dialogue with the unconscious, the first step toward genuine emotional autonomy. Exercise 2. Identifying dependency patterns. Analyze your past relationships. What pattern repeats? Do you tend to be nurturing, dependent, controlling, or submissive? Write in 2 columns, what I always gave in relationships and what I always sought in relationships. Be completely honest. If you notice you always sought security, protection, or validation, you're likely still operating from scarcity rather than abundance. This recognition is critical for interrupting destructive cycles. Write "agreed" in the comments if you're ready to interrupt this destructive cycle. Exercise 3. Defining non-negotiable boundaries. On a sheet of paper, write "I deserve" and complete with at least 20 statements. I deserve respect. I deserve freedom. I deserve to be heard. Then, transform each statement into a clear boundary. I will not tolerate disrespect in the name of affection. I will not trade my freedom for companionship. This exercise isn't purely theoretical. It's a contract you're making with yourself. When a potential partner crosses these boundaries, you'll have clarity for action. Exercise 4. Developing a support network. Loneliness isn't the absence of people, but the absence of connection. Invest in deep friendships, meaningful family bonds, interest-based groups. Participate in community events, book clubs, dance classes, volunteer activities. When you have multiple sources of connection, you don't place the entire burden of your emotional needs on one person. This protects both you and any future relationships from collapsing under the weight of impossible expectations. Exercise 5. Emotional self-sufficiency. Make a list of activities that bring you peace, joy, and fulfillment. Nature walks, meditation, cooking, drawing, writing. Dedicate time to these activities, regardless of whether you're in a relationship. The capacity to create your own emotional well-being is your most powerful defense against toxic dependencies. Exercise 6. Period of conscious evaluation. If you decide to enter a new relationship, establish a minimum 6-month evaluation period before making serious commitments. During this time, carefully observe how this person respects your boundaries and individuality, responds when you say no, behaves in stressful situations, interacts with other people in your life, discusses previous relationships. At 60 or 70, you have enough experience to recognize warning signals. Don't ignore them in the name of romance or out of solitude fears. Those who had the courage to undertake this inner journey emerged transformed, not healed in the conventional sense, meaning freed from all problems, but integrated, capable of consciously bearing their inner conflicts, authentic in their essence, whole in their imperfect humanity. We live in an era of unprecedented psychological fragmentation. Many contemporary problems were predicted decades ago by depth psychology. Loss of meaning, identity crisis, existential emptiness masquerading as consumerism, desperate pursuit of external recognition. But a map back home was also offered. To yourself, to your authentic identity. The encounter with the unconscious, the confrontation with the shadow, the integration of denied aspects. These aren't optional processes. They will happen whether you want them to or not. The only real choice you have is whether this encounter will be conscious and transformative or unconscious and destructive. Will it happen on your terms or life's terms? Will it occur with your consent or through crisis that forces you to awaken? The second half of life isn't a repetition of first half patterns. It's integration, depth, discovery of what was always there waiting for recognition. It's realizing who you genuinely are, not who others wanted you to become. And here's the ultimate truth about relationships after 60. They're possible, they can be beautiful, they can be deeply nourishing, but only when they emerge from a place of fullness, not vacancy. When you no longer require another to feel whole, but choose another to celebrate that wholeness. When relationships don't fill voids, but unite two complete beings who decide to create something greater together. The question facing every person isn't will you be happy, but can you become who you genuinely are? The first question seeks temporary comfort. The second seeks lasting meaning. The first question can be answered with convenient relationships. The second can only be answered through the most difficult and necessary work, the encounter with yourself. And when you do this work, when you confront your shadow and make peace with your solitude, when you become whole and complete within yourself, then, and only then, will you be genuinely free. Free to choose solitude without fear. Free to choose relationships from affection rather than necessity. Free to protect your peace from any person or situation that threatens to destroy it. Because ultimately, the greatest achievement isn't finding someone who completes you. It's becoming whole and then consciously deciding whether you want to share that wholeness with another equally whole person. Therein lies the difference between emotional bondage and authentic freedom, between psychological survival and genuine individuation. Your remaining years needn't be wasted on relationships that drain your energy. They can be the richest, deepest, and most authentic of your life, alone or in company. The choice is yours, but that choice will only be genuinely free once you first obtain the most valuable thing, peace with yourself. If these reflections touched you deeply, if you recognize patterns from your own existence in them, follow this channel and show your support. We'll continue exploring humanity's deepest mysteries, offering maps for navigating existence's most complex territories. Have you experienced the difference between relationships based on necessity and relationships based on conscious choice? By sharing your journey, you might illuminate the path for others facing similar dilemmas. Something called the collective unconscious connects us all. By sharing this content with someone who might be grappling with these issues, you could initiate a transformation process in a person who desperately needs this wake-up call. Remember, your time is precious, your dignity is sacred, your inner peace is priceless. Protect these treasures with the same fierceness with which you protected everything you built throughout your life. Because ultimately, what matters isn't who shared your bed, but who shared your soul. And the first person you must share it with is yourself. Write the word wholeness in the comments if you accept yourself completely.